Gone are the days of like running around trying to get screenshots of like settings and is this thing turned on or off? Like I think the world that we need to live in now is like continuous checking and you let me know if like something's off and absolutely provides like much more assurance in organizing and adopting that mindset and like those types of like continuous controls than we've ever had in the past.
This is KBcast.
Are they completely
As a
cybersecure?
primary target for ransomware campaigns,
Is
as you just
security and
pointed
testing
out,
and performance and scalability
risk and
all that?
compliance,
We can actually automate that.
take that data and use it.
Joining me now is Jadee Hanson, Chief Information Security Officer at Vanta, and today we're discussing if compliance is a minimum standard or a strategic enabler in cybersecurity governance. So, Jadee, thanks for joining me and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so Jadee, I'm really curious maybe to start with when people hear the word compliance, where do you think their mind goes? And I ask this because there's certain words in the industry like audit, governance, risk, compliance. People start to get a little bit nervous. So I'm keen to hear your thoughts and insights on that.
Yeah, I think for most people, when they think of the word compliance or they hear the word compliance, their mind typically goes to checklists, audits, potentially regulatory hurdles, or even fines. It often feels like a blocker or something that is going to slow the business down. I think in reality, we do need to flip the script on this. Compliance is about more than, going through an audit and going through a regulatory hurdle. It's really about building trust with your customers, and that can really turn into a business enabler for you. In many cases, if you can prove compliance and trust, your company is just much more suited to win business, get that next big deal, and get just this agreement with those customers that you want to attract and maintain.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So going back to trust, it's one of those things that's how do you sort of establish that, would you say, given your experience? Because we do speak about this a lot in the industry, but what would be your approach to establish that or to know that businesses perhaps that are listening that are like, yep, I think I've got that level of trust.
Yeah, I think trust can be established in a number of different ways. I mean, at the end of the day, it's around transparency, it's around accountability, transparent on where you are as an organization, what things are in place, what things aren't. If you're selling software, it's not over promising that you have features that you don't actually have. And then I think on the accountability side, it's doing what you said you're going to do. That is certainly establishing trust with your buyers. And I think the last thing that I would mention that it's just like such a huge component of establishing trust is the transparency. And so one thing that we do at Vanta is like we're very, very transparent on where we're at, where we're going. And when we have issues, we're very transparent on this is the issue, this is what we're doing to fix it. I think all of those things combined really, really establish trust with like those folks that you're trying to attract as customers.
Okay, so there's a few things in here that I want to go into a little bit more. So when you said it at the level of integrity, doing what you said you're going to do, one thing that's interesting, and we've seen this sort of happen a lot here in Australia, is, and even recently this week, businesses out there saying, we really care about your security, we really care about your data, and then like a breach happens or something happens. And then, of course, that erodes trust. Now, I'm not saying that these businesses don't take that seriously because, again, security is not, it's a complex thing. It's not an easy thing to do as well. So do you think that customers nowadays, they are looking for more of that integrity in terms of people aren't as loyal to businesses as they sort of used to be? If they can get a better deal, offer, whatever elsewhere, we are seeing that people are willing to move. So how does that sort of sit with you then going back to that integrity and accountability piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fact that there are breaches and more breaches to me doesn't necessarily tie directly to like folks not doing the right things. I think, security is like very complicated space, very complicated area. The adversaries get better and better every year. And so I do think from a company standpoint, like the actions that a company is taking, all the things can be in place and there can still be a human error that causes some sort of issue to happen. And so, yes, I get it. Like anytime that there's a breach or an incident, it erodes trust. But I'll go back to the transparency comment of making sure that when those things happen, I think the following actions from a company and how they show up with the right transparency and the right actions like really changes the narrative.
And when you say how they show up, do you mean how they show up through the breach, and as in how they tell their customers, the way in which they tell their customers, when they tell their customers, all those sort of things?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so one thing that and look, it's really, really hard to do this, but going back to transparency as well, what is it, would you say, again, nowadays that people are looking for? And it's not an easy one to answer because, again, you're not going to make every single person happy. But as a rule of thumb, or generally speaking, what is it, would you say, JD, that people are sort of looking for that they feel like, hey, this business is being honest and truthful, and because they're providing that transparency?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in security, the table stakes are going back to the compliance piece. And really this is like, do you have the standard compliance certifications in place or do you not? And if you don't, where are you and when do you plan to get them? And what are the things that are gaps from the current compliance standards? So starting with like ISO and SOC 2 all the way to maybe the hardest one, which is a US one, which is our FedRAMP authorization. All of the transparency around that I think can be like incredibly helpful. The other thing that I would say that is an area where companies want to see more transparency is effectiveness of like the working controls within an organization. And so, one thing that we do is we have a trust center that you can go to vanta.trust.com and or maybe it's trust.vanta.com. You can go to it and you can see all of the controls that are in place. And what we do is a real-time monitoring of every one of those controls. And you see a little green checkbox of like when the control is in place and when it's not. And so that I think is the future is like a continuous automated way to test for certain controls in place and a very like transparent way to provide like current state to prospects, buyers, and customers alike.
And would you also say, just to add to that, I mean, from my experience working in the field historically, I mean, I worked more in a GRC sort of role on the governance side more so. However, would you say that people feel really overwhelmed by compliance? Because like a lot of these things are quite complicated, complex, arduous. There's a lot going on. People feel overwhelmed, and it's like another thing that they've got to do. So therefore, they're like, "Oh, that's really hard and monotonous." So I'll just sort of put that down towards the bottom of my list, if I'm being honest. So, where do you think now, and how do we sort of make this easier for people? And would you say that is a common reaction from customers that you're speaking to? Is all these things are really overwhelming, JD, and therefore it goes to the bottom of my list?
Yeah, I do think that in certain cases, like compliance can move to the bottom of the list. But I think the one thing that I see, which is really promising, is buyers are demanding like baseline compliance to be in place. And I've heard people describe this as by saying that every compliance control that we pass can be translated into some sort of way a customer is paying for it. And so when you think of that in the broad scale, like it really matters. It matters in every sale that a company has. I think the gone are the days of companies just buying software and engaging with companies without a level of understanding of security compliance. And so you may get by with putting it at the bottom of the list for a period of time, but that will be short-lived because any reputable company is going to like expect that you have some of these baseline compliance things in place and they're going to want to see transparently like where you're at for each of them.
So, baseline compliance, what's your sort of definition in case people are not familiar?
Yeah, I think baseline compliance is like any sort of standard that you want to use to show that you're meeting those specific security controls. So I think SOC 2 is a great place to start. I think the ISO 27001 is a great place to start. Anything like that that kind of gets you moving towards a security framework that has a list of very baseline controls that should be in place at every company.
And then sort of to add to that, so when you get into more like sort of complex things, and if you're in a regulated versus non-regulated industry, what are people sort of looking for on that front then? Just more of a guiding light to say, okay, this is where we've got to go in terms of the direction, or what does that sort of look like?
Yeah, I think, compliance is in large part like the minimum standard. I do think that it is like the floor, it shouldn't be the ceiling. It's a great like starting point for companies' journey in security, but we do have to get beyond that. I think, in great security organizations, you build a more mature, resilient program. Achieving the minimum keeps businesses like legally operating. You have the certification that you can hand out to your customers, but it doesn't really guarantee like the competitive advantage or even like the security resilience. And so like I think security teams like have to go above and beyond to really like solidify like stakeholder trust in what you're doing and how you're moving. So, things that we deal with at Vanta is yes, we have a SOC 2, yes, we have ISO 27001, but certain things are more important to them versus others that maybe aren't necessarily covered in the SOC 2 or are beyond the maturity of controls in the SOC 2. Things like having a bug bounty program in place or having a responsible disclosure process and way to address vulnerabilities like that's all another level of maturity that really builds trust with customers.
Yeah, so JD, you mentioned before resiliency programs. So that's something that's often coming up in my interviews. So do you have sort of your definition of it? And I ask this because everyone defines resiliency programs different, or they say like continuous business, or they talk a lot about crisis management that feeds into resiliency programs. So I'm keen to sort of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think this is a term that it's defined very differently for very different types of industries. And then people among the different, or people also define it differently. And so for me, I think of this like more tied to business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, and really like companies just want to know and feel good that organization has like strong ability to be available when they need them, have a strong ability to come back during after a crisis, and are going to be there when things get tough. And so to me, like I think that there's a lot of times where compliance programs actually like touch on this. Most of like the standard compliance frameworks like demand things within business continuity and disaster recovery and actually like test the fact that you go out and you do like resiliency testing and ensure that yes, you go beyond just having like a policy on paper and teams actually have tested a failover and know that it will work and know that their system will be up and running if there's any sort of emergency.
So now, JD, I sort of just want to move slightly, maybe about 2 millimeters, and talking around compliance being an enabler. Now, this is a really important question, and it's something that we often speak about in the industry, like security is an enabler, or this could be an enabler. But how would you sort of change the conversation for people to understand that about compliance? Because then this is really, really important because often I just hear people throwing the terms out, but not really defining it or not explaining a lot of their thinking behind it. So I'm keen to understand how this sits with you.
I actually love thinking about compliance as an enabler. I think it is a foundation for scaling responsibly. And when done right, it builds this like customer confidence along the way and it accelerates deals, helps the company win. It also reduces risks in ways that directly support business growth. And so as a company grows and gets bigger deals and bigger customers, they expect certain things to be in place. And you're sort of like reducing risk and meeting certain controls at the same time that customers are asking for those things to be in place. So it's not a surprise that companies like favor brands that focus on security and trust. I've heard people describe this by saying that every compliance control that we pass can be translated into like the something that people pay for. I think tools like Vanta, they certainly like help enable this. And That's why we think of the Vanta solution as like a trust management platform, really establishing trust and again, like being that enabler.
And would you say as well, people's sort of mindset is shifting more towards, yeah, okay, I see what you mean. It is more of an enabler rather than like a sunken cost or all this investment, or we're buying things that is not tangible. Are people in the industry moving away from that, would you say?
It takes a strong leader to be able to like tie to business impact and bottom line, but I absolutely like think that companies are like much more thinking about like compliance and security programs as being like a foundational requirement to enable the business.
Enterprise tech leaders know that compliance isn't just about ticking boxes, it's about risk, reputation, and revenue. That's why companies trust Vanta to streamline their security and compliance workflows at scale. With deep integrations and automated evidence collection, Vanta takes the manual audit grunt work out of the frameworks like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and GDPR. Visit vanta.com/KBcast. VANTA.com/KBcast to learn more. And I know you sort of mentioned it before, but maybe let's open it up just slightly around, the definition of that minimum standard around compliance. Because again, depending on who you speak to or depending on who you ask, you'll have different versions of it. But I'm keen to really understand your thoughts because again, you've made some really good points here today, and I think it's quite easy and digestible for people to understand.
Yeah. So compliance, like through the lens of like the minimum standard, I think the minimum standard is just that. It's like the floor, it's not the ceiling. We often see companies like start to think about compliance when a vendor requires a SOC 2. And it's a great like starting point for companies that want to start in SOC 2 or he mentioned ISO 27001. Like very great starting point. I think it's just the macro thing that I would want to point people to is to remember that it is the starting point for building a more mature, resilient program, and achieving the minimum keeps like the business like legally operational, but it doesn't like guarantee that competitive advantage and going kind of beyond the basics to establish that stakeholder trust. One of the ways that I've heard people describe about compliance as like a minimum standard was like having a driver's license. It's you can be on the road. The driver's license allows you to be on the road, but it doesn't say anything about how mature or skillful you are as a driver. For those that are listening who have new drivers in the house like I do, this analogy like really hit home for me.
And would you say, going back to your analogy, would you say most businesses today that you're seeing is just being the driver on the road, or do you think people are getting a little bit more advanced in their driving capability?
I think most businesses, if I'm to generalize, are meeting the standard and not yet maturing beyond that. Again, like it depends on like what compliance standard they're after. But going beyond the basics is really going to come from like further customer demands to do it, a company that like really puts security first in the organization and wants to see the company operating in a secure, mature way. As the company grows, I think it becomes more and more critical. As a company starts out, I do think that they're probably like just meeting the standard.
And you also mentioned before it doesn't guarantee competitive advantage. So talk to me a little bit more about what do you mean by that?
Great companies really prioritize like trust. They prioritize trust and safety. And I think consumers as well as companies like gravitate towards those companies that prioritize trust and safety. And so two companies can look alike and they both have ISO 27001 certification. But if there's one that's like being really transparent, that's being really accountable and really pushing the needle, I think consumers and companies will gravitate towards that company over the other in the sense of like, people want to do business with a company that prioritizes like trust and safety.
Yeah, for sure. And that's interesting because now I'm starting to see, especially here in Australia, a lot of advertising, especially with banks. I mean, I worked in a bank more than 10 years ago and we didn't do a lot of that. But nowadays I'm starting to see like these banks saying like, we really care about like phishing emails and scams and we're really taking it seriously. So I am seeing a push in terms of marketing around that. than maybe historically in security. So I would agree with you on that front.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, so there's a couple of other things around. We mentioned before about the drivers just sort of being on the road, and you like saying people are now going to start to go beyond, or they haven't really. So, would you say if you were to look forward, we will start to see these fuels sort of going beyond based on all the factors you mentioned before, especially around trust and companies having that competitive advantage, etc. So, would you envision that this is something like when you come back and you speak to me a year later, you say, "Yeah, Krista, people are getting a little more advanced with their driving," or how do you sort of see that unfolding?
I mean, I absolutely think that this is the start. If you think about like just like the security industry, it really hasn't been the data security industry really hasn't been around for that long. And you've seen just
Mhm.
like a massive amount of uptick in people prioritizing this, companies like making sure that they have like strong, mature security teams. And so I think this is like just the beginning and this is going to continue to grow and companies are going to continue to prioritize this.
Okay, so now I want to move to, and you, everyone would have heard this. It's not just a tick box, or it's just a tick in the box for companies. And I think this is such a big thing to address because it's something that we often hear in this space. How would you sort of advise companies to look past the proverbial ticking of the box when it comes to compliance? And I think I really want to get your thoughts and understand your mindset around this because it's something that I've heard for literally years, but then people still default to it, or they're saying, "Oh, but that company just sort of did the tick in the box and then they moved on and they were not really compliant." And you've heard all of these sort of things. So I think this is a really big one to address and to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah, this one is really interesting. So I think looking beyond ticking the box or looking beyond kind of that point in time is really all around what Vanta is fantastic at, which is continuous compliance. So I think we need to shift the mindset from being reactive to proactive. Compliance needs to matter beyond just when you're doing or your audit or just when you're preparing for your audit. So moving away from this like point in time, ticking the box to a more continuous, always on security and compliance program will more actively demonstrate trust. It will protect against threats in a meaningful way and certainly protect against like reputational damage. So for us, like again, like I mentioned, like we display our controls externally. We have a continuous monitoring of the controls in place. And so these are checked, whether it's like daily or weekly or monthly cadence, but these are checked regularly. And then we transparently show what controls we are meeting. And that to me is like moving beyond ticking the box.
So back when I was doing like actual, I used to create dashboards around compliance, but it was all manual. So I used to have to pull all of the feeds, create like a Tableau dashboard, and then it had to be like maintained like daily. But all of that was super manual, right? And then like every day, JD, someone would come up to my desk saying, "Oh, like what's happening on that front?" So I'd have to refresh it, make sure something was working, or if one of the spreadsheets there was an error, then my whole thing wouldn't work. So there was a lot of frustration then around that. So going back to the continuous side of things, would you say now leaders or board, this is something they're going to want to see because again, that demonstrates the trust. It also is sort of keeping people. There's that pulse check, right? Because if you're just doing it once a year or once every couple of months or once when you know you've got an audit or something on, you sort of remove from your finger on the pulse a little bit, and that's when issues can start to arise, right? So is this going to be more of a focus now for executives and boards?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think for me, like I don't want to learn about a compliance control failing, minutes before my audit and I should have had it in place for the last year. And so like that's the game-changing move with continuous compliance. It really shifts the ability for teams to just like have this like real time view of like their compliance posture and know exactly where they need to fix things. They don't need to wait for the internal audit. They don't need to wait for the external audit. They have like a real time view into what's going on and what needs to be addressed.
And would you say as well that sort of adds that extra layer of assurance because you know sort of where you're at? Because again, I mean, if you're doing this arbitrary once a year. You're sort of crossing your fingers and hoping that, oh, I hope those things are all going well. And like you said, it could come up to the minutes and something's gone wrong and you don't have time to fix it. So would you say that people are probably sleeping better at night because they got that assurance there and they sort of know where things are at least?
I absolutely. I mean, gone are the days of like running around trying to get screenshots of like settings and is this thing turned on or off? Like I think the world that we need to live in now is like continuous checking and you let me know if like something's off and absolutely provides like much more assurance in organizing and adopting that mindset and like those types of like continuous controls than we've ever had in the past.
And then would you also say as well that it's giving people time that, okay, if there's an issue, hey, we've got time to really think about this. It's not like at the 11th hour and we have to make crazy decisions. So would you say that overall the security posture is of a higher standard because there is that continuous compliance happening there that people can sort of say, hey, actually we've got an issue, we need to fix it. And we have some time to fix it before, the audit happens, for example, or something else happens. So are you starting to see that as an overall trend as well?
100%. Yeah. Anytime that you're going to have like more real time visibility and insights, like your maturity goes up, your program is just much more healthy, your team has more time to address things that they need to address. There's just so many benefits from that continuous approach.
And would you say if you were to zoom out with the continuous approach, would you say this is going to be like the go-to thing or it's going to be like a standard that's going to be implemented by governments? Because again, especially if you're in a regulated industry, there's not a lot. If something goes wrong, like really can go wrong, and we've seen that in cases here in Australia, or they have to do a whole investigation, they get fined, they get all these sort of things, right? Or they're at risk potentially of losing some of their financial services licenses as well if certain things go so crazy or awry. So would you say that this is going to be something that we start to see now moving forward or
Yeah, I think this is going to become a standard. I think security teams are going to demand to operate this way. They're going to see the benefits and they're just going to want to operate in this model. And I think buyers alike are going to demand some sort of like compliance, continuous compliance over current state. Like I'll send you a report once a year. In the US, we've already seen this start to take shape. Right now, there is a federal compliance authorization that is largely based on NIST 853. And what the federal government is changing now is they're moving to what they're calling key security indicators and they're forcing those key security indicators to be things that you can continuously monitor in an automated basis. And so I think we're like starting to see this take shape. One, from a standards perspective and security teams seeing the value and wanting to move this way.
and what's one thing, JD, that you think people when you talk about continuous compliance, for example, what is it that you think people aren't aware of or don't quite understand that you have to keep explaining a little bit more?
I don't think people understand the efficiency gains from doing it a different way. When you think about the old way we used to do compliance, we had a number of different controls, and folks had to run around in an organization and grab screenshots and get insight into exactly how a control is working. And they had to share those screenshots with auditors and follow up. And today, we have so much that we can build into some sort of like automated check or test to give us the visibility and the evidence that we need. And I don't think people understand what a game changer it is from an efficiency standpoint and how it allows just so much like time back within the security team. And so that's really fun to like see teams adopt this approach and have just incredible success on efficiency.
Do you think people are reluctant because it's like they don't know what they don't know yet, or we've always done it this way? There's a lot of that thing, or hey, I've been doing this sort of function for 20 years and now I've got to change to doing something else, which I'm not familiar with. Or where do you think people's mindset is towards that?
It's a great question. I think in general, and I'm a compliance person, so I'll be the first to say this. I think compliance people maybe aren't like the most like innovative people and like willing to like jump in and try something completely new. And so I think there's that a bit of that reluctance just in the industry in general. Other than that, I think any sort of change and doing something differently is scary. And so just not fully understanding what continuous compliance means is also something probably holds people back.
And Jadee, I know you sort of touched on it before, but I'm curious maybe to understand from yourself, like as we look forward, things are changing every day. I mean, I'm in media and I'm seeing like every day there's something happening, something news coming out. But in the world of compliance or your world of compliance, where do you sort of see the industry going overall from here? You've spoken a little bit more about the US and maybe some of these things will start to spill over into Australia and your Asia Pacific. But is there anything else you'd like to share with us today?
When we think about the world of compliance over the next few years, there's a couple things. I mean, continuous compliance, we talked at length about that. I think that absolutely is something that is taking shape. I expect more automation tools and platforms to offer continuous compliance, something that Vanta has been doing from day one. The other thing that I think is going to evolve is our use of AI and AI to support compliance. I think it introduces, obviously, there's risks with AI, but I think that there's a lot of like untapped opportunity. In the Vanta platform, we're using AI to map policies to controls and to allow companies to get a questionnaire and have it filled out right away. We're also, I was leveraging a AI feature today when we went through our policy review and like outlining pieces of our policy that maybe are out of sync with the controls that we have in place. And so like really leveraging AI agents and AI insights to help us do our programs better and to help us identify like where we might have gaps, I think is going to be a huge game changer for us. The last thing I would call out in the world of compliance is I do believe that there is going to be regulation convergence. Today we have, so many different standards and there's lots of overlap, and I think over time like we're going to see more and more convergence, even if it's like between like Australia and the US and the EU. What we want is like more universal standards. And so I'm hopeful and I expect that we'll see more of that over time.
And Jadee, lastly, do you have any sort of closing comments or final thoughts you'd like to leave our audience with today?
I think maybe just like a invitation to check out Vanta, check out some of the continuous compliance stuff that we're doing, check out some of the AI stuff that we're working on, a number of things. Obviously, we run our Vanta platform internally within my GRC team. And so a number of the things that we're building, we have like direct ability to influence. And so just an invitation to check that out, give us your feedback. My team also writes a lot of internal articles that are always like done so well. And so any resources and whatnot that you can get your hands on, I would love like your review. I hope they help you. If there's any feedback that you have on any of them, I'm on LinkedIn, hit me up, ask some questions.
This is KBcast, the voice of cyber.
Thanks for tuning in. For more industry leading news and thought-provoking articles, visit kbi.media to get access today.
This episode is brought to you by Mercsec, your smarter route to security talent. Mercsec's executive search has helped enterprise organizations find the right people from around the world since 2012. Their on-demand talent acquisition team helps startups and mid-sized businesses scale faster and more efficiently. Find out more at mercsec.com today.